I then, as I prepared this talk, and without thinking about it too much until I got to the end, I tried to figure out, what are the most important lessons or messages I would have. And I found that I'm not quite sure about the title of the slide, but I wrote down 3 words for myself. I wrote down academics, students, and leadership. And of course, what this means is that the starting point from my thinking now in relation to quality assurance is to do with the human perception of its value. Because this is really what we're dealing with here. It is the people who are the embodiment of the cultural system of an organisation. It is not the policies, it's not the documents. And I started looking at these 3, and I have a number of observations to make which are common to all 3. And the first is that after 30 years in higher education, I have come to be totally surprised by the things that people do not know when they come into higher education for the first time. And that relates to all 3, academics, students, and leaders. And therefore, I would suggest that the starting point for improving quality within any institution has to focus on the inculcation when people join that organisation. I think that we are very poor, and I'd say it of my own organisation and every other one that I've worked in. We do not put enough time into developing what I suppose would be the professional and ethical understanding of academics and students at the point of entry into the system. And I treat both the same way here. I believe that if I had, I often have a kind of vision of building my ideal higher education institution. It would be quite different from many of the things that I have either done, and indeed it would involve a lot of things I haven't been able to do. But one of the things I would spend an awful lot more time on would be the business of spending time with new staff and new students so that they come to understand the thinking which lies behind higher education itself. And I think, it was alluded to by Kevin McCarthy this morning because it's one of the reasons which gave rise to the recommendation in Hunt on the need for a professional qualification in teaching and learning and also for ongoing professional development, was that we don't, in fact, attend very strongly to the notion of how people teach or how people learn. And we spend an awful lot more time looking at people's disciplinary expertise than we do looking at their capacity to either teach or learn. And secondly, in relation to students, we need to get our heads around the notion that for many students, readiness is the key issue. It's not capability. Students very often have, particularly those who come from socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds, may confront huge issues in terms of readiness to understand the system in which they find themselves. My favourite example of it comes from a sister of mine, and I was very fortunate in that I had a brother and a sister, both of whom did not go directly into higher education and returned to it much later in life. And my sister rang me about 10 days into it. She was going back to do a nursing course. There were 5 other mature students in her class. And in the first 2 weeks, the class were told that they needed to write a referenced essay on the notion of being a woman in the work of Simone de Beauvoir by one lunatic lecturer. Right? Now, she rang me and all 5 mature students were ready to run out the door. They had no idea where to start. And of course, I explained to her that those who had come in directly from the second level system took with a grain of salt the things that they were being told week 1 and week 2. They had a capacity to understand that perhaps not everything was to be taken quite so literally. But I think we're very poor at this business of transitioning. And I think it gives rise to huge problems for students who have come from a system, be it Irish or international, where there has been such a focus on prescription of learning. They now find themselves in an environment where things are quite different and where it's very difficult for them to understand what's expected from them. And I remember it from my own experience in First Arts. I'll never forget that at the end of that first year, I could not have told you, when I had finished my exams, had I passed, failed, or come first in the class. I had nothing against which to calibrate my own efforts or performance. So I think that students and staff, and there are many, many people here in this room, who if we sat down together would not make a much, much better job of looking at this business of transitioning into third level. And I think as a consequence we would find that the performance of students would be hugely enhanced. The other thing I would say in relation to students is that expectation and setting high goals for students is enormously important. I believe that if students know the standards to which we wish them to aspire, they will make efforts to move in that direction. And thirdly, I would say, and particularly I suppose in relation to leadership, be it within an institution or in the system nationally, I think these messages that I hope conveying here today about the importance of expectation, about the business of culture, about giving people a fair chance to understand the professional and ethical standards that are expected of both, that these things are terribly significant. And I think when I read codes of practice for students, for example, or when I read, let's say, the new induction handbooks for staff, that I don't think that any of us do it well enough. I think that if we get it right at that stage, we will make a lot more progress. I then decided that there was one other issue that I particularly wished to address, and some of it I think may be apparent from what I have said already. I believe that one of the great failings in relation to quality assurance is we don't attend sufficiently to the different perspectives on expectations. And I want to start with one issue, assessment. There isn't a student who has arrived in GMIT in the last 20 years whom doesn't know when they come in day one that they're going to have to do a set of exams at the end of the year. And their first focus will always be, what am I going to be expected to do in the exam? What will I have to know? How many questions will I have to do? So on. Now, it's remarkable when we construct courses and programs that we tag on assessment as an afterthought and that we never start where the students do. The students start always at what's expected of them and the assessment that will be required of them. And I believe that if we're going to attend to improving standards, that one of the key areas of intervention in each of our colleges would relate to improving the knowledge of the staff in relation to the quality of assessment. Most of us in this room tend to teach and assess in the way we were taught and the way we were assessed. Education is a uniquely private endeavour because when you walk inside the door of a classroom, you tend to be operating as a sole trader in that environment. We don't do enough, I think, to improve our own knowledge about the variety and indeed the changes in relation particularly to assessment, and we don't do enough to look at how that might impact on the performance of students. We also don't do something else well enough, and I learned about it in a very different environment. And sometimes we're not good either at vertical learning in Ireland. My first experience of assessment was not in third level. It was as a very young graduate correcting honours leaving cert English. And all new correctors were brought to one room in Athlone. I still remember it. We were given all the guidelines. They went through them line by line. And then 3 essays were given to us, and we were asked to mark them using the guidelines. 2 of them were fine. On the 3rd essay, in a room with 50 people in it, the mark ranged from 32 to 97 on the same essay, right? It was a wonderful learning experience. And one of the things that I think would be most useful at a very pragmatic level in colleges would be setting up disciplinary groups in relation to improving the quality of assessment and looking at the notion of disciplinary standards. Now, I say so because this emerged as a serious matter in Hunt, and it was fueled very much by much of the public commentary I've referred to, this lamentation about standards and grade inflation. I think the answer lies in our own hands, and I strongly am in the camp of believing that we should own the quality assurance systems and we should move ahead of the prescription. So I would recommend within institutions, the establishment of disciplinary groups, particularly as a starting point, to look at the issue of assessment. That would be the first place I'd start. The second thing, I suppose, that increasingly was a concern as the Hunt Group considered its recommendations. As we met more and more external groups, two things became an issue. One was relevance and currency within curricular provision, and the extent to which within our programme development we can move particularly to look at those two criteria. Relevance in terms of the overall award, currency in terms of the learning. This was not an argument that we shouldn't teach Latin. It was nothing to do with that. It was actually looking at many of the professional areas where the nature of the curricular provision is lagging the moves in the environment in which people are going to work. And this, I think, requires a great deal more outward-facing, I suppose, enterprise on the part of institutions, so that we can be a bit braver about deciding what are the things we don't really need to be doing on a programme and what are the things that should be there that we're not prepared to consider. In Canada, a number of years ago in engineering, they started at the other end. They moved out to people who were 10 years out of college in the engineering domains, and they looked at the kind of learning which would have underpinned their professional development, and they worked back. We tend to start very often with a kind of fixed notion of what it is that constitutes the foundations of learning in an area. And I don't believe we have done a lot of rigorous analysis of the currency and relevance of that thinking.